The WRA created conflict by disenfranchising parents and placing official authority in the hands of children. This countered Japanese cultural values of deference to one's elders and filial piety. As the federal government became the provider of occupational opportunities, the male heads of households lost their positions as the primary providers for the Japanese American family. To make matters worse, camp authorities used loyalty questionnaires to distinguish between loyal and disloyal Japanese that could be enlisted in the armed forces. Asking Japanese Americans to prove their merit by serving in the United States Armed Forces to defend a nation that trampled their basic civil liberties was absurd. Furthermore, the stress of eviction itself magnified tensions within patriarchal households for those families that remained together. Incarceration weakened the Japanese American community by relocating former internees upon their release from camp. Internment itself stigmatized Japanese Americans as disloyal by their very removal, making it difficult for them to assimilate into society after their release and even when the perceived security threat had passed. By the spring of 1943, when it was clear that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was not a military necessity, more than 90% of the Japanese American population on the United States mainland still remained in the camps, not leaving until late 1946. Roosevelt hesitated to end the incarceration until after the first cabinet meeting after the November 1944 election, because any move toward opening the camps threatened to undermine the legal basis for continued dispersion of internees throughout the country. The White House feared that if the court declared Executive Order 9066 unconstitutional, the government's authority to implement the controlled settlement of Japanese Americans outside the West Coast would end. FDR and his advisors were faced with a dilemma of their own creation. Having established a drastic evacuation policy, the White House could not simply admit that a mistake had been made. Although Roosevelt recognized that internment was legally indefensible, he was left with no choice but to gradually dismantle the camps. Ultimately, internment infringed upon basic liberties guaranteed by the Constitution to United States citizens. At a time when the United States prepared to defend democracy against the threat of fascism, its leaders authorized and oversaw undemocratic actions that blatantly ignored constitutional freedoms. In relocating an entire group of Americans without formally pressing charges against them or individually determining their loyalties, the federal government suspended basic constitutional rights, such as the rights of personal security, the rights to move about freely, to live and work where one wants, to establish and maintain a home, and the right not to be deprived of these rights except upon an individual basis and after charges, notice, hearing, fair trial, and all the procedural requirements of due process of law. Internees were denied the guarantee of equal and non-discriminatory treatment implicit in the Fifth Amendment. In 1944, a young Nisei man named Fred Korematsu challenged the government's infringement of the rights of Japanese Americans. Korematsu had refused to evacuate the West Coast and had been arrested for violating DeWitt's exclusion orders. He challenged his arrest as a violation of his citizenship rights. On December 18, 1944, in Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the government had acted constitutionally in February of 1942 in ordering the emergency exclusion of Japanese Americans from West Coast areas. Justice Hugo Black declared that the Army had reason to believe that Japanese Americans posed a danger to national security. Ultimately, the decision was a legalization of racism. Korematsu is a historic case in American law, not only because it upheld internment, but for its declaration that classifications based on race were inherently suspect under the Constitution. This ruling paved the way for the post-war struggle for civil rights by African Americans. It would not be until November of 1983 that Korematsu's eviction for evading internment was overturned, after Korematsu challenged the earlier decision. Although Japanese Americans recognized the injustices brought against them, most of them, unlike Korematsu, were unable to challenge their perpetrators. Barred from being citizens and unable to vote in many cases, Japanese Americans were excluded from the governing society and represented a powerless minority. Furthermore, the Supreme Court refused to evaluate cases other than those that dealt directly with Executive Order 9066, and the Justice Department endorsed a plan that permitted multiple spot searches without a warrant and supported the belief that being an enemy alien was adequate cause for implementing a search. Refusal to condemn the program resulted from acceptance by the judges of the primary features of the Oriental stereotype. The mass relocation of Japanese Americans was an unprecedented event in the United States. It was a migration against free will, enforced by the federal government, which placed American citizens in an unknown and desolate environment. By mid-1946, all Japanese American camps created during World War II were officially closed. However, deep scars left from relocation and injustices suffered would not fade for years to come. In 1988, after the insistent prodding of Japanese Americans, Congress belatedly passed the Civil Liberties Act. The act formally apologized and issued presidential pardons for those who had resisted detention orders and the eviction, offered financial redress to Japanese Americans, and recommended government agencies to restore Japanese American employees lost entitlement or status. It was intended to prevent racial prejudice from ever again mitigating government infringements of civil liberties and basic rights. Sadly, it will take more than a piece of legislation to overcome the immense anguish and inequalities endured by thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II.